My wife was cheating on me by switching places with her twin sisters. One day I noticed a mark on my wife, and after some time, that mark disappeared. From that point forward, I started to watch closely, looking for more of those strange occurrences. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, but I didn't know what it was. It felt like I was missing some crucial piece of the puzzle, some hidden detail that would make everything click into place. Sarah and her sisters were always close, but lately, their bond seemed even more mysterious than usual. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the events around the bandaged fingers didn't sit right with me. How could all three of them have the same injury in the same spot? One night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I stayed up, trying to piece everything together. That's when an idea struck me. What if they were switching places? It sounded ridiculous at first, but as I replayed all the strange moments in my head, the theory didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. The matching haircuts, the identical bandages, the odd behavior. Could they have been swapping roles this whole time without me realizing it? I needed to know for sure. So, I came up with a plan. The next time Sarah and I were alone together, I marked a smalt on her back using a green marker. It was subtle, hidden just under her shoulder blade where her bra strap would cover it. I knew that if they were switching, the mark would disappear when one of her sisters took her place. The first few days passed without incident. Sarah acted like her usual self, and the green remained in place. I started to doubt my suspicions, thinking maybe I had just imagined things. But by the end of the week, something changed. One night, as Sarah was getting ready for bed, I noticed the mark was gone. In its place was a small scar I hadn't seen before, a scar I was certain Sarah didn't have. I didn't say anything that night, but my mind was racing. The woman standing in front of me wasn't Sarah. Over the next few days, I tried to keep calm and observe without drawing attention. Each time I marked Sarah, the dots would disappear after a few days, replaced by new marks, scars, or no marks at all. It became clear to me that Sarah and her sisters were taking turns pretending to be her. I was stunned. How long had this been going on? Was this some kind of game they played? I couldn't believe I had been sharing my marriage with 3 different women without knowing it. The breaking point came one evening after a particularly strange week. Sarah, or at least the woman who claimed to be Sarah, was acting unusually distant. When we got into bed, I asked her directly, "Who are you tonight?" She froze, staring at me as if I had uncovered her deepest secret. "What are you talking about?" she replied, trying to brush it off. "I'm serious," I said. "Is this Sarah, or are you Katie or Kelly? I need to know who I'm sharing this bed with." She stammered for a moment, unsure of what to say. "Matt, I'm your wife. Why would you ask me something like that?" I didn't back down. "Because I've been watching. I've seen the marks disappear and reappear. I've seen the scars, the bandages that don't match up. I know you've been switching places with your sisters." Her face went pale, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She didn't deny it, which only confirmed my worst fears. I continued, "You think I haven't noticed, but I have. The haircuts, the injuries, the behavior. It's all been adding up. So tell me, who are you?" She hesitated before finally admitting the truth. "It's not what you think, Matt. We never meant to hurt you." "That doesn't answer my question," I said firmly. "Who are you?" "I'm Sarah," she said quietly, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I shook my head. "I don't believe you. How long has this been going on?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down, clearly struggling to find the words. "A long time," she finally said. "Since before we got married." I felt a wave of anger and disbelief wash over me. "You've been doing this the whole time? How could you?" She reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "It's not like that, Matt. We didn't mean for it to happen this way. We've always done everything together, ever since we were kids. It's just how we are." I stood up from the bed, pacing the room as I tried to wrap my head around what she was saying. "You've been switching places with your sisters, pretending to be each other, and I had no idea. You lied to me, Sarah." "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I'm sorry." "Sorry?" I repeated, incredulous. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. Do you have any idea what this feels like? To realize I've been married to 3 different women and didn't even know it. She was crying now, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. Not yet. We love you, Matt, she said through her tears. All of us. That's why we did it. We didn't want to lose you. Her words only fueled my anger. You did it because you love me? That's your excuse? You've been deceiving me for years, and you think that's love? She didn't answer, just sobbed quietly. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I need to know everything, I said. I need to know why you thought this was okay, and how long this has been going on. No more lies. She wiped her eyes and nodded. Okay, I'll tell you everything. Over the next hour, Sarah explained how the deception had started. It began as a way for the sisters to share their responsibilities, switching places whenever one of them needed a break. But over time, it became more than that. They started swapping roles more frequently, testing each other's boundaries, and eventually, they began sharing everything, including their relationships. I listened in stunned silence as she confessed that Katie and Kelly had both pretended to be her at different times throughout our marriage. They had been playing this game for years, and I had been completely oblivious. We never meant for it to get this far, Sarah said. But once we started, it was hard to stop. We thought you wouldn't notice, and for a long time, you didn't. I was speechless. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have ever imagined. I had trusted Sarah, believed in our marriage, and now I didn't even know who she really was. I can't do this, I finally said, my voice shaking with emotion. I can't keep living this lie. I need time to think. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed a bag and started packing. Sarah watched me in silence, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to get away, to clear my head and figure out what to do next. As I left the house, Sarah called out to me. Matt, please don't go. We can fix this. I love you. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I needed space, time to process everything that had just been revealed. My entire world had been turned upside down, and I wasn't sure if I could ever put it back together. I checked into a motel that night, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become. The woman I thought I loved, the woman I had married, wasn't who I thought she was. And now, I had to decide if I could ever trust her again. The next few days were a blur. I stayed at the motel, avoiding calls from Sarah and her sisters, trying to figure out what my next move should be. I considered leaving for good, filing for divorce and never looking back. But part of me still loved Sarah, if that was even her real name. On the third day, I received a call from Brad, Katie's husband. He wanted to talk, so I agreed to meet him at a local bar. When I arrived, Brad looked exhausted, like he had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. I heard about what happened, he said as we sat down. Sarah told me everything. I'm sure she did, I replied, not bothering to hide my bitterness. Brad sighed. Look, I know this is messed up. Trust me, I've been dealing with it for years. But you should know that it wasn't always like this. When I married Katie, I didn't know either. They kept it from me too, for a long time. I frowned. You knew about this? Yeah, Brad admitted. I found out a few years into our marriage. At first, I was furious, just like you. I didn't understand how they could do something like this. But over time, I realized it's just part of who they are. They've been doing this since they were kids, switching places, sharing everything. It's how they've always lived their lives. That doesn't make it right, I said. No, it doesn't, Brad agreed. But it's not as simple as you think. They love you, Matt. All of them. That's why they did it. I shook my head. I don't know if I can ever trust Sarah again. I get it, Brad said. I felt the same way. But once I understood that it wasn't about deceiving me, that it was about their bond with each other, I realized I could still love Katie. She's the same person I fell in love with. The switching didn't change that. His words made sense, but I wasn't ready to accept them. I don't know if I can live like that, I admitted. Brad looked at me sympathetically. You don't have to decide right now. Take your time. Figure out what you want. But don't throw away something good just because it's not what you expected. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I could ever see things the way Brad did. My marriage had been built on a lie, and I didn't know if I could ever look at Sarah the same way again. That night, I returned to the motel and lay awake for hours, thinking about everything Brad had said. Could I learn to accept what Sarah and her sisters had done? Could I forgive them? The next morning, I made my decision. I called Sarah and told her we needed to talk. We met at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. Sarah looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Matt," she began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Just listen," I said. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you for what you did. But I love you, Sarah. I always have. And I'm willing to try to make this work. But there have to be changes." She nodded, hanging on my every word. "No more lies," I continued. "No more switching places. If we're going to stay together, it has to be just you and me. I need to know that I'm with you, and only you." "I promise," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I'll never lie to you again." It wasn't a perfect solution, and I wasn't sure if our relationship would ever fully recover, but I was willing to give it a chance. After all, love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to stay, even when things get messy. And things had certainly gotten messy. The next few weeks were a delicate balancing act. Sarah and I were trying to rebuild our relationship, but the damage caused by years of deception was not easy to repair. Every time I looked at her, the same question lingered in my mind. Was this really her, or was I still being deceived? True to her word, Sarah kept the promises she made at the cafe. No more switching places with her sisters. No more lies. But even with her efforts to rebuild my trust, I couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. How could they be? I had spent years unknowingly living with not one, but 3 women. I had shared my most intimate moments with people I didn't even know. Despite my reservations, I was committed to making it work. I loved Sarah, or at least, I loved the version of her that I thought I had known. But now, I had to learn who the real Sarah was. Without the interference of her sisters, without the constant swapping, I needed to figure out whether the woman I married was someone I could still love, or if the years of deception had irreparably broken what we had. To complicate things, Katie and Kelly hadn't completely faded into the background. They were still part of Sarah's life, part of our life. The 3 sisters were incredibly close, and I couldn't expect them to sever their bond just because of my feelings. Yet, every time I saw them together, I couldn't help but wonder how deep their deception had gone. What else had they hidden from me? Was there anything left that I didn't know? One night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind kept replaying all the moments that had seemed normal at the time, but now felt tainted by the knowledge of what had really been happening. The late nights, the odd conversations, the times when Sarah seemed distant or distracted. How many of those moments were shared with someone who wasn't even her? I decided I needed some answers. I couldn't move forward with my life until I knew the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. So, the next day, I sat Sarah down and told her we needed to talk. Really talk? "Matt, I've already told you everything," she said, her voice tired but patient. "I don't think you have," I replied. "I need to know the whole story, not just the surface-level details. I want to know why you did it, how long it's been going on, and why you thought it was okay to keep this from me for so long." She sighed and ran her fingers through her hair, clearly reluctant to revisit the past. But she knew I wasn't going to let it go. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay, I'll tell you everything." We sat down at the kitchen table, and Sarah began to recount the history of her and her sisters. It went back further than I had realized, much further. The 3 of them had been swapping places since they were children. At first, it had been innocent, switching for fun to confuse their teachers, playing pranks on their friends. But as they got older, the swapping became more serious, more calculated. "It wasn't always like this," Sarah explained. "We didn't plan for it to go this far. It just happened. One of us would get overwhelmed with something, and the others would step in to help. We've always done everything together, and over time, that extended to our relationships." I frowned, trying to understand. "But why? Why did you think it was okay to let your sisters pretend to be you with me? Didn't you think I deserved to know?" "It wasn't about you," she said quietly. "It was about us. We've always been so connected, so in sync. We never thought of ourselves as 3 separate people. We were always just one unit. It didn't feel like a lie. because to us, it wasn't. I shook my head, struggling to wrap my mind around her reasoning. But I didn't know that. To me, you were Sarah, not Katie or Kelly. You didn't give me a choice. I know, she admitted, her eyes filled with guilt. And I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. But once it started, it was hard to stop. We didn't know how to go back. So, you just kept it going, I said bitterly, even though you knew it was wrong. Sarah looked down at her hands, unable to meet my gaze. Yes. The weight of her admission hung heavy between us. I had asked for the truth, and now that I had it, I wasn't sure if I was ready to handle it. Over the next few days, I distanced myself emotionally, trying to process everything Sarah had told me. I couldn't help but feel like my entire marriage had been built on a lie. The woman I had fallen in love with didn't exist, not in the way I had believed. She was just 1/3 of a larger whole, part of a collective that I had never been a part of. As the weeks went by, I found myself spending more time alone. Sarah tried to give me space, but I could tell she was hurting too. She had genuinely believed that I would be able to accept what had happened, that our love could survive the revelation. But I wasn't so sure. Every time I looked at her, I saw the faces of her sisters, and I couldn't help but wonder how many moments I had shared with them instead of her. Then came the incident that pushed me over the edge. It was a Saturday evening, and we had planned to have a quiet night at home. Sarah was in the kitchen making dinner, and I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone. Everything seemed normal, until I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Kelly standing there, looking nervous. "Hey, Matt," she said hesitantly. "Can we talk?" I frowned. "Sarah's inside. Is everything okay?" "It's not about Sarah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about us." A knot formed in my stomach. "What do you mean, us?" Kelly glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. "Can I come in? I really need to talk to you." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her in. We sat down in the living room, and Kelly wasted no time getting to the point. "Matt, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began. "And I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. None of us did." I crossed my arms, unsure of where this was going. "But you did. All of you did." "I know," she said quickly, "and I'm sorry. But there's something else I need to tell you, something Sarah hasn't told you." My heart sank. I thought I had heard everything, but apparently there was still more to the story. "What is it?" I asked warily. Kelly hesitated, clearly struggling with whatever she was about to say. "The thing is, I've had feelings for you. For a long time." I stared at her, stunned. "What?" "I know it's wrong," she said, her voice breaking, "but it's the truth. I've always been attracted to you, and that's part of the reason why we started switching places. It wasn't just about helping Sarah. It was about me, too. I wanted to be with you." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This was a betrayal I hadn't expected. Sarah's sister, her own flesh and blood, had been harboring feelings for me all along. And not only that, but she had acted on those feelings by pretending to be Sarah. "You need to leave," I said, my voice cold and controlled. "Matt, please," she started, but I cut her off. "Go. Now." Kelly looked like she was going to argue, but then she saw the expression on my face and thought better of it. Without another word, she stood up and walked out the door, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. How could this have gone so far? How could Sarah not have known about Kelly's feelings for me? I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly for hours. I didn't know where I was going or what I was looking for. All I knew was that I needed to get away from everything. Eventually, I found myself at a park on the outskirts of town. I parked the car and sat there for a while, watching the sun set over the trees. The weight of everything pressed down on me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I couldn't hold it together anymore. I broke down, tears streaming down my face as I thought about everything I had lost. My marriage, my trust, my sense of reality. It had all been shattered. And now, with Kelly's confession, I didn't know if there was anything left worth saving. I spent the night in the car, too exhausted and emotionally drained to go anywhere else. By the time morning came, I had made my decision. I couldn't stay with Sarah. I couldn't live with the constant reminders of what had happened, the knowledge that I had been lied to and deceived for so long. As much as I had wanted to make things work, it was clear now that there was no going back. When I returned to the house the next day, Sarah was waiting for me. She must have known something was wrong, because as soon as I walked through the door, she asked, "What happened?" I didn't have the energy to dance around the issue. I talked to Kelly. Her face paled. "What did she say?" "She told me everything," I replied. "About her feelings for me. About why you three started switching in the first place." Sarah looked like she had been slapped. "Matt, I didn't know. I swear I didn't." I believed her. But that didn't change anything. "It doesn't matter anymore, Sarah. This isn't working. I can't do this." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Please don't say that." "I'm sorry," I said softly, but firmly. "I've tried, but I can't live with this. It's too much." She broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably as I stood there, unable to comfort her. I wanted to. I wanted to hold her, to tell her everything would be okay. But I couldn't, because it wouldn't be. "I'm leaving," I said quietly. "I'll stay at a friend's place until I figure out what to do next." She didn't try to stop me. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, as I packed a bag and walked out the door. I didn't know what the future held for me, but I knew one thing for certain. The life I had built with Sarah was over. There was no salvaging it. The trust had been broken beyond repair, and there was no way to piece it back together. For the first time in years, I was alone. In the days following my decision to leave Sarah, I tried to keep myself busy. I moved in with an old friend, someone I hadn't seen much of since I got married. He didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated. The fewer people who knew the details of my marriage's collapse, the better. I wasn't ready to explain it to anyone. How could I even begin to describe what had happened? The story was too bizarre, too unbelievable. The only thing I could do was keep my head down and try to figure out my next steps. For the first time in years, I was living alone. Well, mostly. My friend, John, was there when he wasn't working, but we kept our interactions light. He gave me the space I needed, and I spent most of my time in my temporary room, going over everything that had happened. It was like a fog had descended over my life. I felt disconnected from everything around me, unsure of how to move forward. The separation from Sarah had hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the loss of our relationship. It was the loss of the future I thought we'd build together. We had plans, dreams, a life that we had mapped out in our heads. And now, all of it was gone. In its place was uncertainty, confusion, and a sense of betrayal that I couldn't shake. Sarah called me a few times during that first week, but I didn't answer. I couldn't talk to her. Not yet. I needed to clear my head, to figure out what I wanted before I could have any kind of conversation with her. I wasn't ready to confront everything that had happened. I wasn't sure I ever would be. One evening, John suggested that I get out of the house for a bit. "Go grab a drink or something," he said. "You've been cooped up in here for days. It'll do you good to get some fresh air." He was right. I had been isolating myself, hiding away from the world like it could somehow shield me from the pain I was feeling. But I couldn't hide forever. So, I took his advice and went to a nearby bar, hoping to clear my mind. The bar was quiet when I arrived. It was the middle of the week, so there weren't many people around. I found a seat at the counter and ordered a drink, trying to blend into the background. I didn't want to be noticed. I just wanted to disappear for a while, to lose myself in the noise of other people's conversations and forget about my own problems. But fate had other plans. I had been sitting there for about an hour when someone slid onto the stool next to me. I didn't look up at first, too absorbed in my own thoughts to care who it was. But then I heard a familiar voice. "Matt?" I turned, and there she was, Melissa. Of all the people I could have run into, it had to be her. She looked just as surprised to see me as I was to see her. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice a mix of shock and confusion. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her expression unreadable. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, neither of us sure what to say. Finally, Melissa spoke. "I didn't expect to run into you," she said. "I thought you were still living with Sarah." "I'm not," I said bluntly. "I left." Her eyes widened. You left? Why? I sighed, unsure of how much I wanted to reveal. But Melissa had always been different from her sisters. She wasn't as wrapped up in the games they played, and she had never seemed as complicit in the deception. If anyone deserved an explanation, it was her. I found out about everything, I said quietly. The switching, the lies, all of it. Melissa's face fell, and she looked away, guilt evident in her expression. I figured you'd find out eventually, she admitted. I tried to talk them out of it, you know. I told them it wasn't right. But Katie and Sarah, they wouldn't listen. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to blame her, to accuse her of being just as guilty as her sisters. But the other part of me knew that Melissa wasn't the one who had initiated all of this. She had been caught in the middle, just like I had. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice strained. Why didn't you say anything? Melissa sighed, running a hand through her hair. Because I didn't know how. They're my sisters, Matt. We've been doing everything together our whole lives. I didn't want to betray them, but I didn't want to hurt you either. I was stuck. Her words echoed the same sentiment Sarah had expressed during our conversation, but somehow, it felt more genuine coming from Melissa. She had always been the quiet one, the one who kept her thoughts to herself. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she had struggled with the choices her sisters had made. I'm sorry, she said after a long pause. I should have done more. I should have told you the truth. I nodded, appreciating her honesty. But it didn't change the fact that the damage had already been done. So what now? I asked, not really expecting an answer. Melissa shrugged, her shoulders slumping. I don't know. I haven't talked to Sarah or Katie since everything happened. I needed some space too. We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. It was strange, being there with Melissa after everything that had happened. There was a time when I had seen her as nothing more than Sarah's sister, someone on the periphery of my life. But now, sitting next to her, I realized that she had been affected by all of this just as much as I had. Eventually, Melissa stood up. I should go, she said, her voice soft. But if you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. I watched her leave, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. But one thing was clear. My life had been irrevocably changed by the choices Sarah, Katie, and Melissa had made. And now, I had to figure out how to move forward. Over the next few weeks, I tried to focus on rebuilding my life. I found a new place to live and started to settle into a routine. But no matter how hard I tried to move on, the weight of what had happened still hung over me. It was like a shadow that I couldn't shake. I hadn't spoken to Sarah since the day I left. Part of me wanted to reach out, to see if there was any way we could salvage what was left of our relationship. But every time I thought about calling her, I remembered all the lies, all the times she had deceived me, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I focused on myself. I threw myself into my work, spending long hours at the office to distract myself from the mess my personal life had become. It wasn't the healthiest way to cope, but it was the only thing I could do to keep my mind off of everything. And then, one day, I got a call. It was from Melissa. Matt, I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear, but I think you need to talk to Sarah, she said, her voice hesitant. She's not doing well. I felt a pang of guilt at her words. Despite everything that had happened, I didn't want to see Sarah suffer, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to face her yet. What do you mean, not doing well? I asked. She's been a wreck since you left, Melissa explained. She blames herself for everything, and honestly, I think she's right. But she's not going to get through this alone. She needs to talk to you, Matt. She needs closure. I hesitated, torn between wanting to help Sarah and wanting to protect myself from more emotional pain. But deep down, I knew Melissa was right. Sarah and I needed to have one final conversation, for both of our sakes. Okay, I said after a long pause. I'll talk to her. We arranged to meet at a cafe the next day, the same one where Sarah and I had had our last serious conversation. As I sat at the table, waiting for her to arrive, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. This was it, the final chapter of our relationship. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that whatever happened, things would never be the same. When Sarah walked in, She looked like a shadow of her former self. She had lost weight, and there were dark circles under her eyes. It was clear that the past few weeks had taken a toll on her. "Hi," she said quietly as she sat down across from me. "Hi," I replied, unsure of what else to say. We sat in silence for a moment, the tension between us palpable. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I'm sorry, Matt," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for everything. I know I can't fix what I did, and I know I hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But I need you to know that I never meant for things to get this bad. I love you. I always have." I looked down at the table, my hands clenched into fists. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her, but the wounds were still too fresh. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "You lied to me, Sarah. You let your sisters lie to me. You betrayed my trust in ways I didn't even know were possible." "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "And I hate myself for it. But I need you to understand that I never wanted to lose you. I thought we could make it work. I thought you'd never find out." "That's the problem," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You didn't think about me. You didn't think about how I would feel if I ever found out. You were only thinking about yourself, about your sisters. You didn't give me a choice, Sarah." She sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold herself together. I know I was selfish. But I love you, Matt. I still love you." I felt my heart break all over again. Despite everything, a part of me still loved her too. But love wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. "I can't do this," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't go back to the way things were. Too much has happened. Too much has changed." Sarah wiped her eyes, nodding as if she had expected this. "I understand," she said, her voice shaky. "But can we at least try to be friends? I don't want to lose you completely." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Could we be friends after everything that had happened? Could I ever look at her and not be reminded of the lies, the betrayal? "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe, but not right now. I need time, Sarah. I need time to heal." She nodded, though I could see the pain in her eyes. "I'll wait," she said quietly. "As long as it takes, I'll wait." We parted ways that day with no clear resolution. The future was uncertain, and I didn't know if we would ever truly be able to move past what had happened. But for the first time since I had left, I felt a sense of closure. I had said what I needed to say, and now it was time to start rebuilding my life. The months that followed were difficult. I focused on myself, on healing the emotional wounds that had been left behind. I didn't reach out to Sarah, and she respected my need for space. Slowly, I began to find my footing again. Eventually, I started dating again. It wasn't easy at first. I was still carrying the scars of my past relationship, and trust didn't come as easily as it once had. But over time, I learned to open up again, to let people in. And then, one day, I met someone new. Her name was Emily. She was kind, thoughtful, and completely different from Sarah in every way. We took things slow, building a relationship based on honesty and trust. It was a refreshing change from the deception and lies that had defined my previous relationship, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Sarah and I never rekindled our friendship. She moved on with her life, and I moved on with mine. We stayed in touch sporadically, exchanging the occasional text or email, but the closeness we once shared was gone. And that was okay. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. As I stood at the altar on my wedding day, looking into Emily's eyes, I realized how far I had come. The pain of my past had shaped me, but it hadn't defined me. I had learned from it, grown from it, and now I was ready to start a new chapter. This time, there were no secrets, no lies, just love. And that was enough. Life after my wedding to Emily felt like the beginning of a new era. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was in a relationship where trust wasn't an issue. Emily was different from anyone I had ever met before. Calm, supportive, and honest in ways I hadn't known were possible. We built our lives together on a foundation of mutual respect and love, without the shadows of secrets lurking in the background. But no matter how much happiness I found in my new life, The memories of my past still had a way of creeping up on me. I had learned a great deal from my previous relationship, lessons that both strengthened and scarred me. Sarah and her sisters had left an indelible mark on me, a constant reminder of how easily trust could be broken, even by the people closest to you. Despite everything, I never truly hated Sarah. How could I? At one point, I had loved her deeply, and I had built my life around the idea that she would be my partner forever. But the hurt she caused wasn't something that could be easily erased, even with time. Every so often, I would find myself thinking about her, wondering how she was doing, if she had managed to move on as I had. I hadn't heard from Sarah since that day at the cafe when we said our goodbyes, and I preferred it that way. It wasn't that I wished her ill, but I knew that revisiting those old wounds would only bring pain. I had a new life now, and that life was with Emily. Still, there were moments when my mind would drift back to the past, back to the complicated, tangled web of emotions that Sarah, Katie, and Melissa had left me in. I had spent years unknowingly caught in their game of deception, and it was only when I walked away that I could truly see how deeply it had affected me. Now, I was determined to move forward, to build something real with Emily that wasn't tainted by lies or half-truths. Emily had heard bits and pieces about my past relationship, but I never felt the need to delve into the full story. She knew that I had been hurt, that I had gone through something difficult, but I didn't want my past to define our future. Emily never pressed me for details, respecting my need to keep certain things private. And for that, I was grateful. As time went on, our lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. We moved into a new house, started talking about building a family, and shared everything with each other. Emily had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel special, whether it was a quiet Sunday morning spent sipping coffee on the porch or an evening walk through our neighborhood. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. But peace doesn't mean that the past simply disappears. About a year after our wedding, I received a message that shook me in a way I wasn't prepared for. It was from Melissa. "Hi, Matt. I hope you're doing well. I know it's been a long time, but I've been thinking about you. I heard through mutual friends that you got married, and I'm really happy for you. I'm not sure if you'll want to hear from me, but I wanted to reach out. There's something I think you should know. If you're open to it, I'd love to meet and talk." Seeing her name on my phone screen sent a jolt through me. It had been so long since I'd heard anything from Melissa, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of me wanted to delete the message, to continue with my life without looking back. But another part of me, a part that I thought I had buried, was curious. What could Melissa possibly want to tell me after all this time? I sat with the message for a few days, debating whether or not to respond. I hadn't spoken to any of the sisters since I left Sarah, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to open that door again. But something about Melissa's message felt different. There was a sincerity in her words, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she wanted to tell me was important. Eventually, I decided to reply. "Hi, Melissa. It's been a long time. I'm not sure what there is to talk about, but I'm willing to meet. Let's set up a time." We arranged to meet at a cafe a few towns over, far enough that it wouldn't feel like I was stepping back into my old life. On the day of our meeting, I felt a sense of apprehension building in my chest. I hadn't seen Melissa in years, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Had she changed? Had I? Would this conversation bring closure, or would it only stir up old feelings that I had worked so hard to bury? When I arrived at the cafe, I spotted Melissa sitting at a table near the back, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked much the same as she had the last time I saw her. Her hair a little longer, a few lines on her face that hadn't been there before, but still unmistakably Melissa. She smiled when she saw me, though there was a trace of nervousness in her expression. "Matt," she said softly as I approached. "It's good to see you." "Yeah," I replied, taking a seat across from her. "It's been a while." We sat in awkward silence for a moment, both of us unsure of how to start. Finally, Melissa spoke. "I wasn't sure if you'd agree to meet," she admitted. "I know things didn't exactly end well between us." "That's an understatement," I said with a wry smile, though there was no real malice in my voice. I wasn't angry with Melissa anymore. Time had softened the edges of my hurt, and I could look at her now without feeling the same sense of betrayal that I once had. Melissa nodded, her expression serious. You're right. I know you probably don't want to talk about the past, but there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been carrying with me for a long time. I leaned forward slightly, curious despite myself. What is it? She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. I know I should have told you this years ago, but I wasn't brave enough. I didn't want to hurt you more than I already had. But you deserve to know the truth. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Melissa, what are you talking about? She looked down at her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. It's about Sarah, she said quietly. There's more to the story than you know. The knot in my stomach tightened. I had thought that I had heard everything there was to hear about Sarah, that I had uncovered all the lies. But now, sitting here with Melissa, I realized that there was still more buried beneath the surface. Go on, I said, my voice steady despite the unease I felt. Melissa hesitated for a moment before continuing. When we were switching, it wasn't always just for fun. There were times when Sarah wasn't sure if she could handle things. She was struggling, Matt. She didn't know how to deal with everything, and she thought that if we could share the burden, it would make things easier for her. I frowned, not quite understanding. What do you mean? Was she sick? Melissa shook her head. Not physically, no, but emotionally, she was going through something none of us really understood. She was overwhelmed by everything, by the pressure of the relationship, by her own insecurities. She didn't feel like she was enough for you, and she thought that by involving me and Katie, she could somehow compensate for that. I sat back in my chair, the weight of her words sinking in. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't any of you tell me? We were scared, Melissa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't want to lose you, and we didn't know how to explain what was going on. We thought that if we just kept pretending everything was fine, eventually it would be. I felt a surge of frustration and anger, not just at Sarah, but at the whole situation. But it wasn't fine, I said, my voice rising slightly. You didn't give me a choice. You let me live in this fantasy, thinking everything was normal, when the reality was completely different. I know, Melissa said, tears welling up in her eyes. And I'm so sorry for that, Matt. I should have said something. I should have told you the truth. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell Melissa that her apology wasn't enough, that it couldn't erase the years of lies and deception. But another part of me, the part that had moved on, that had built a new life with Emily, was tired of holding on to the anger. What about now? I asked, my voice softer. How's Sarah doing? Melissa wiped her eyes, composing herself before answering. She's better, I think. She's been in therapy for a while, trying to work through everything. She's not the same person she was back then, but I think she's finally starting to understand what she did and why it was wrong. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how I felt about that. It was good to know that Sarah was getting help, but it didn't change what had happened. Why are you telling me this now? I asked after a long pause. Melissa looked at me with a mixture of guilt and sadness. Because you deserve to know the full truth. I know it doesn't change anything, and I know it won't make up for what we did. But I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I appreciated her honesty, even if it had come far too late. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. I don't know if it makes things any easier, but I'm glad you finally told me the truth. Melissa gave me a small, sad smile. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us one day, even if it takes time. I didn't respond right away. Forgiveness was a complicated thing, especially when it came to something as deeply painful as what I had been through. But as I sat there with Melissa, I realized that holding on to my anger wasn't serving me anymore. I had a new life now, a life that wasn't defined by the mistakes of my past. Maybe it was time to let go. I'll try, I said finally. That's all I can promise. We parted ways on that note, and as I walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of closure settle over me. The conversation with Melissa hadn't been easy, but it had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, a sense of finality. I knew now that there was nothing left unsaid between us, and that gave me a kind of peace I hadn't expected. When I got home that evening, Emily was waiting for me in the kitchen, her face lighting up as I walked through the door. Hey, she said, wrapping her arms around me. How did it go? I leaned into her embrace, feeling the weight of the day lift off my shoulders. It went better than I expected, I said honestly. Melissa told me some things I didn't know. Things about Sarah. Emily pulled back slightly, concern etched on her face. Are you okay? Yeah, I said, nodding. I think I am. We spent the rest of the evening talking, and for the first time, I opened up to Emily about everything that had happened during my relationship with Sarah. I told her about the lies, the switching, and the complicated emotions that had followed me for years. Emily listened without judgment, holding my hand as I worked through the memories. By the time I had finished, I felt lighter, as if a burden I had been carrying for far too long had finally been lifted. I'm so glad you told me, Emily said softly, squeezing my hand. I know that couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, I admitted, but I think I needed to say it out loud, to let it go. And I had. For the first time in years, I felt like I had truly let go of the past. Sarah and her sisters were a part of my story, but they didn't define me anymore. I had built a new life with Emily, and that was all that mattered now. In the weeks that followed, I continued to move forward, focusing on the life I had built with Emily and the future we were creating together. Every once in a while, memories of my past would surface, but they no longer held the same power over me. They were just that, memories. And while they had shaped me in many ways, they no longer controlled me. One day, as Emily and I sat on our porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, I realized something. I was happy. Truly, deeply happy. I had found peace in a way I never thought possible, and for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The past was behind me, and the future stretched out before me, full of possibility, and I was ready to embrace it. Years passed, and my life with Emily continued to flourish. We had built a strong, loving foundation, free from the complications that had plagued my past. Every day, I was reminded of how different things were now. The trust, the openness, and the honesty we shared were things I never took for granted. I had learned from my mistakes and the betrayals I had endured. This time, I was determined to do everything right, and Emily's love made it easy to believe that we could. We eventually started a family. Our daughter, Olivia, was born 2 years after we were married. She was the joy of our lives, her laughter filling our home with a warmth I hadn't known was possible. Parenthood changed us both in ways I couldn't have predicted, making us stronger as a couple, more understanding of each other's needs and fears. Every challenge, every sleepless night, every worry about the future only made our bond grow stronger. Emily was an incredible mother, and I marveled at how naturally she took on the role. Watching her with Olivia reminded me daily of how lucky I was to have found someone who loved so completely and gave so selflessly. The love between Emily and me deepened as we built our family, each milestone adding to the tapestry of our life together. But as my new life unfolded, I couldn't help but wonder about Sarah from time to time. It wasn't because I still had feelings for her. I had long since moved on from that chapter of my life, but because she had once been a part of my journey. And no matter how much time passed, some part of me would always wonder how she had fared after our tumultuous ending. I never reached out to her, though. I didn't want to disrupt the delicate balance I had achieved, and I didn't feel the need to rehash the past. But life has a strange way of bringing things full circle when you least expect it. One afternoon, when Olivia was about 5 years old, Emily and I decided to take her to the park. It was one of those perfect days where the sun shone brightly, and a gentle breeze blew through the trees. We packed a picnic and spent the day watching Olivia play on the swings and run through the grass with the kind of carefree joy only a child can possess. As we sat on a bench, enjoying the moment, I noticed a familiar figure walking toward us. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was Sarah. She looked different, older, of course, and more serious than I remembered. But there was no mistaking her. I hadn't seen her in years, not since our last conversation at the cafe, and the sight of her stirred a mix of emotions I wasn't quite prepared for. Emily noticed my sudden change in demeanor and followed my gaze. "Is that?" she asked softly. "Yeah," I replied, nodding. "That's Sarah." Sarah approached us with a tentative smile, her eyes flickering between me, Emily, and Olivia, who was now running toward the slides. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew this moment was inevitable, Our paths were bound to cross again eventually. "Hi, Matt," Sarah said, her voice calm but a little strained. "It's been a long time." "It has," I replied, standing up to greet her. "How are you?" "I'm good," she said, glancing over at Emily with a polite smile. "You must be Emily." Emily stood up and extended her hand. "Yes, I'm Emily. It's nice to meet you." Sarah shook her hand, and for a brief moment, the tension between us felt like it might dissipate. "You have a beautiful daughter," Sarah said, nodding toward Olivia. "She looks so happy." "She is," I said, feeling a pang of pride. "She's our everything." There was a pause, and I could tell that Sarah was working up the courage to say something more. I braced myself, unsure of what was coming. "I wanted to apologize," Sarah said finally, her voice quiet but steady, "for everything. I've had a lot of time to think about the past, and I realize how much I hurt you. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I'm sorry, Matt. Truly." Her words were unexpected but not unwelcome. I had long since made peace with what had happened, but hearing her apology gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "I appreciate that. And I hope you've been able to find peace too." Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of her journey. "I have. It took a long time, but I'm in a better place now. I've done a lot of work on myself, and I've made peace with the choices I made." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, meaning it. We stood there for a moment, the three of us, the past hovering between us like a distant memory. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was clear that we were all different people now, people who had grown and moved forward. After a few more pleasantries, Sarah said her goodbyes and walked away, leaving me and Emily standing together, watching Olivia play. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, placing a hand on my arm. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. "Yeah," I said, "I am." As we sat back down on the bench, I realized that seeing Sarah had been the final piece of the puzzle I needed to close that chapter of my life for good. It was over now. The hurt, the betrayal, the confusion. I had moved on, and so had she. The years continued to pass, and my life with Emily and Olivia remained the center of my world. We welcomed another child, a son named Lucas, into our family, and the joy he brought us only deepened the love we already shared. Life had its challenges, as all lives do, but through it all, we had each other. As Olivia and Lucas grew, I often found myself reflecting on the lessons I had learned from my past, the most important of which was this: love, real love, cannot survive without trust. It's a lesson I had learned the hard way, but one that I carried with me every day in my relationship with Emily. She was my rock, my partner in every sense of the word, and the life we had built together was more than I could have ever hoped for. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset after the kids had gone to bed, Emily turned to me with a smile. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "All the time," I replied, taking her hand in mine. "I can't imagine my life any other way."